So, it's Friday, dear listener. Imagine you're about to go out to a staff do, where someone you quite fancy will likely turn up. But you've had one of those days. Work was tedious and awful. A friend sent you snarky remarks, and when you got home, the cat had pissed on your bedding. And you glance in the mirror, and somehow, everything is wrong. Your face, your clothes, your posture, even the way you stand. Maybe you notice a bit of puffiness in your face, or that hairline that's just not quite what it used to be. A lack of the desired musculature or the gut you swore you'd eliminate last Christmas. You start cataloguing faults, like evidence in a trial against yourself. Jesus, what is he, she, they going to think of you looking like this? You must have aged suddenly or sagged like an old mattress overnight or worse. Eventually, declaring yourself unworthy of public appearance, you decide to wait till you've hammered down in the gym and intermittent fasted for 4 weeks before appearing in front of anyone, most especially this person you want to impress. So you spend the weekend hungry, alone, avoiding anyone you know lest they comment on what you look like, and trying to console yourself that you have, at least, made a start on what you can call self-improvement. Welcome to the loneliness industry. If this is your first time, this is a philosophy podcast where we make it clear that loneliness is not a personal failing, it is a structural issue. I'm Jordan Rain, a philosophy graduate from New Zealand, and I'm here to help you decode the bullshit that passes as wisdom and serves to keep you stuck. Today, we're decoding the dogma that persists in the body control industries, meaning the health, fitness and wellness industries, the so-called beauty industry, and the menopause industry. Yep, there is one, and it's worth around $24 billion at present. Hands up if the way that you think your body looks has ever made you miserable. If so, I feel for you, and I mean that, because it turns out that the perceived need to control our bodies can be directly linked to loneliness. That personal resonance is what made me select today's example industry to illustrate part 3 of our Dogma theme. This week is a tour into one of the many specific arenas where Dogma presides, where profitable facts get reframed within a worldview that sells well, yet makes you miserable. As we saw last week in episode 14, Dogma begins where curiosity dies, when the desire to know gets replaced by the need to control what counts as knowledge. In that context, facts can be so removed from context that their usefulness lies in creating obedience rather than in any truth. Foucault talks about this a lot, and today we will too. Now, when we get to apply control to ourselves, instead of having it applied to us, it can help us feel safe. It can serve as an antidote to fear. But all too often, the fear that lies behind control can have undesired effects. And if you've ever dated a manipulator, you will have experienced an example of this. When control presides, connection dies. And in the cult and culture of bodily control, be that for appearance or health motivations, something similar happens. Within the framework of dogma, our belief in the tools for controlling our bodies and the need to consistently control them also leads to loneliness, measurably and often tragically. This is almost the exact opposite of what is promised, which is along the lines of hundreds of people flocking towards you like you're in a high-gloss deodorant ad. And as you all know, if you're male, non-binary or any other gender, this is not a gender-specific problem. The market knows that regardless of who you are, or which gender you have, or want to abstain from performing, it can sell you an idealised version of that. A version that nobody can live up to for more than about 5 minutes, but that everybody can be convinced, via unreason, is one they should want and strive for. The messaging is that having such bodies will gain us acceptance, love, health, and an easier life, regardless of the fact that control of every aspect of our body really works long term, no matter what the current, most trending factoid-based tool professes. Today, we enter the territory where dogma starts selling us shiny solutions and dreamlike promises in response to our fears, particularly our fears of rejection. Today, we look specifically at how our bodies become the battleground on which dogma, power, self, and market forces fight for dominance. In Foucauldian terms, we're looking at how power inscribes itself directly onto flesh. In Lasch's terms, we're looking at how bodily control is tied to identity and its performance. And there'll be a lot of lived experience in this too, because we're going to trace a long, long road from philosophy to the sociological impacts to the psychological impacts. So tune in as we follow the trajectory of what happens when science delivers facts to markets, only to have those markets rip said facts from their contexts and gift wrap them in the values of capitalism. This is all about how the fixation with applying constant control to our bodies leads to massive, massive profits, but also to in-group and out-group creation, policing ourselves, policing each other, isolation, loneliness, and even the decimation of the very thing we were hoping we could polish to perfection. And if you can relate to our opening story, well, another situation in which I truly feel for you. I have often caught my reflection looking back at me like that, like, yeah, your only remaining hope is to drag this bad lighting around with you. And I'm only half kidding, because observe how badly lit my videos always are. In seriousness though, I must have cancelled at least 4 daytime events in the last year, thanks to the ludicrous levels of self-criticism that come with being middle-aged and no longer able to pull off androgyny. Now, that is the ideal I fell for. But the flavour of the ideal we have in our heads is actually irrelevant. The point is that we strive for it at all, because psychology shows what that striving leads to on a personal level. For example, the perfectionism social disconnection model shows that socially prescribed perfectionism, meaning that believing others expect you to be perfect, predicts shame, defensive self-presentation, lower perceived support, and most relevantly here, greater loneliness. We behave to hide flaws and curate impressions, and our relationships thin out. What philosophy shows is less talked about, but that's where it starts. Through our striving to fit these ideals, power perpetuates itself by repackaging the very values that ensure its continuation. Now, this episode is not aimed at making anyone feel bad or stupid about opting for the currently marketed ways of controlling their appearance. Now, I've been a slave to so much of the so-called health industry's tools for most of my life. And as I've said before, I am not doing this because I'm healed. I found myself acting out a living example of this stuff, as you may have too. I've repeatedly hidden from the world, thinking that I'm not up to scratch visually. And at 51, in hormonal upheaval, the marketed promises of bodily control become transparently flawed. Yep, we are not actually in control of a lot of things, like our hypothalamus or whether or not we are hit by a comet, for example. Now, your reaction to that might be of interest. Maybe you're thinking, but Jordan, there are things you can do to stay in control. HRT, keto, intermittent fasting, weight training, blah, blah. Like all the solutions we're sold, they are not a holy grail, meaning they work for some, and for others not at all, and for some, they are damaging. If those were your first thoughts, though, it is useful information, and no judgment. That exact response is how the market trains us to respond, with a so-called reassuring, don't panic, it's okay, control can still be yours. I mean, that's how I responded to it. Fuck, there must be something I can do, which all shows us how much we desire control and how much the idea of it can feel reassuring. And even if you're a bit like I am and generally associate control with Orwellian dystopias or people so stiff with self-censorship that they have no personality, it seems that none of us are fully immune to the ideal and drive towards bodily control. I mean, medical professionals will obsess over your BMI for you, despite its poor correlation with health outcomes. So it's almost impossible to escape. Now, recalling episode 14 though, flawed tools like BMI are spoiler alerts for dogma, because when we cling to tools that research has undermined, and we cling to them simply because it's habit or what everyone else does, we're prioritising conformity over validity. Now, most dogma has a moral element too. The whole you can control your body thing has become a you should control your body thing. In terms of logic, that's a category error, so no validity. And yet, a system of ethics and even worth has been woven into bodily obsession, meaning we feel guilty or flawed when we fail at it or fail to try. In short, and what today is about, controlling our bodies and appearance is an example of dogma that has become part of our worldview. It is a paradigm whose foundations are invalid, but yet still refuse to shift. Our culture's fixation on youth, body perfection, which is often done on the pretense of health, are now established, and they resonate perfectly with capitalism's values, especially control. So for markets that perpetuate this dogma, the sales pitch can always be the same. You can reach those ideals, you just need the right tool and to try hard enough. If that feels like deja vu, yeah, ye old neoliberal mantra blaming you when products do not work. Perfect fit. Now today is in 3 parts. We start with a philosophy, looking at why our rituals and beliefs around bodily control is actually dogma, and not simply about the marketing of tools of questionable efficacy. For that, we'll recap Jaspers and Kuhn, and how knowledge stagnates into dogma when curiosity is publicly lynched on Jimbro forums. Foucault will show us how dogma perpetuates power by shaping what counts as knowledge, and via the construction of moral satans who induce fear in us simply by virtue of being so overweight and old. Part 2 explores the sociological effects of all this, the values and behaviours that emerge when bodily control dogma and capitalist ideology get married. Here, Christopher Lasch and standard marketing textbooks show us how purchases and practices are tied to individualism in terms of identity and identity performance, and where in-groups and out-groups are made as well. Part 3 is the personal psychological outcomes of all this. We'll show how adhering to the whole control it all mandate leads to social withdrawal, low self-esteem, loneliness, isolation, and worse. And trigger warning on that, and I'll warn you again when we get there. We'll end with the stuff on where to go if you want out of this eyes wide shut blood ritual farce. This is for anyone who feels like the first part of their life was wasted conforming to practices that fail to buy belonging, and that the rest is wrestling with undoing all that messaging. So for part 1, we welcome back Carl Jaspers, who built us a bit of a radar for detecting what he calls unreason. Jaspers points out that when inquiry is shut down, we're no longer interested in deepening knowledge. We want whatever factoids we have to remain as they are, because we like them that way. When we block curiosity and shut down inquiry, we aren't doing reason at all. We're performing what he calls unreason. Examples of this abound in diet and fitness culture, where anyone who questions the current holy grails is slain in public to the cheers of forum-addicted onlookers. Try saying, "But it looks like calories in, calories out is not the whole story," on a Jimbro forum. You'll be excommunicated before your spirulina protein shake has settled. The personal insults flood in about making excuses for being overweight. How about when you ask, did keto make anyone else feel like death? I did this one personally, and I got the usual mantra, anyone who feels bad on keto isn't doing it right. Translation, you failed and not the diet. And of course, in middle age, you get to unlock more dogmatic horrors like the final level on some video game where the prize is a massive turd. I once posted this. Anyone else find that intermittent fasting worsened their hormonal issues? The rage that got met with did look a lot like the premenstrual meltdowns I was experiencing on a daily basis, and should probably have proved my point. Now, in all of these examples, content providers themselves will defend things a bit more rationally. There's usually some paper they can cite that has an inkling of logic to it, though, be wary and check out episode 15 for the tricks of the trade that kick around. Most of you will know that if you hang out on PubMed long enough, you can find evidence for both sides of any story. Studies concluding that hormones did not affect the 9 women in the study, for example, alongside studies that show it did have an effect. The use of research papers indicates something important though. When science furnishes saleable data that's been made marketable, that data is prioritised. It is held up to discount any further data, meaning to say debate will not be entered into. We cherry pick what backs us up and say this is a definitive answer, end of story, a faux terminus. We talk more on the mechanics of this in the last 2 episodes, and it outlines the ways that inquiry is quietly shut down. To recap quickly though, Kuhn talks about how the quest to deepen our understanding gets stalled, especially when it involves questioning current worldviews. When research goes beyond our favourite facts and does unearth contradictions to the current way of thinking, well, that research is steadfastly ignored for as long as possible until something really breaks. See Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions or episode 14 of this podcast for more on that. Anyway, during these stalling periods, citing stuff that contradicts the favoured worldview is met with anger or discrediting of the messenger. Like the first time a friend of mine told me, the gut microbiome matters more than willpower, and I accused them of being a fecal fetishist. Yeah, I'm no saint either. For more live examples of such ad hominem madness, just look at the comments under people like Dr. Stacey Sims' videos. Now, she's one of the world's leading researchers on female physiology, and when she presents data on things like the fact that intermittent fasting and keto can, in fact, have some very deleterious results in women in perimenopause, the reactions, often from women themselves, are extreme, personal, and designed to shut down dissent. Now, in the case of most holy grails today, if you don't cherry-pick your own data, it's clear that they just don't work for everyone. Some people find them useful or half useful, and some people are actually harmed. Now, that's not our main focus here, and I really do assume that it's a no-brainer for you guys, seeing as we're all quite different sacks of chemicals, meaning the whole one-size-fits-all thing should be fairly unconvincing. You know, humans are not standardized central units for plug-and-play devices. And if you could just reboot your hormones and install a new mindset patch, I wouldn't be here. What really matters here, in terms of identifying dogma, is the reaction when you question popular theory. And you may even notice your own reflex when a holy grail is questioned. Even my saying, yeah, works for some, not for others, sometimes it's detrimental, can feel like sacrilege for some. Again, no shame, because that's how strongly this whole system perpetuates itself. The point is this, though. If a tool has become unquestionable, we're not in the land of reason anymore. We're in the land of unreason. The vehemence with which holy grails are defended is a sign that this is not about facts. What it is about, instead, is very personal and sometimes very surprising. A surprise we'll get to soon enough. For now, though, a little more on the human involvement in truth-making. Humans, as we know, are not perfect. Surprise, surprise. Kuhn reminds us that when new evidence contradicts a beloved worldview, science itself stalls. The research gets ignored, the messenger discredited, and curiosity goes out the window. At least until enough anomalies pile up and they really have to do something. But if even scientists can turn away from deeper questioning for reasons as small as things like reputation or tenure, imagine the motivation when money is at stake. Markets have their own reasons to stall questioning. Questioning a product or a tool, or the theory underwriting it, can end profit. If we found out, for example, that smoking did not promote health, rather it compromised it, the tobacco industry might lose revenue, and yeah, that already happened, after years and years of that industry stalling the release of information that threatened their profit. But I actually don't want to get sidetracked into debunks, okay? The point here is that facts will be coveted or filtered depending on their usefulness. You know, that's potentially old news by the third episode. What I really want to get to is that all this goes much deeper. Take intermittent fasting and keto as examples. There is a whole industry around it. And, you know, many people argue, oh, it costs nothing, especially those doing content around how to do both effectively. But here is the crucial point. Holy grails hold up more than profits. They hold up an entire way of seeing. Ways of seeing that the system wants intact. And this is the real clincher. Yes, intermittent fasting might not cost you extra, but imagine saying this. I'm not interested in intermittent fasting or keto because, you know, I don't really care about my body size. Cue protein shakes imploding on company executives and the distant grinding of capitalism recalculating its macros. You are not just refusing a tool there, you're refusing the foundational fear that a much broader market runs on. The anxiety around not looking attractive enough props up the entire adjacent ecosystem. Not giving a shit about how attractive you are to others might actually be the biggest act of so-called sacrilege there is in this system. Hence, it's also the biggest rebellion. I mean, imagine how different your day would look if the fear of looking unacceptable was gone. How many things would you stop buying, watching, aspiring to, and how much time would you save? Let's remember the other signs of dogma though, because this is another sign of dogma. Dogma doesn't only shut down curiosity, that is the first clue. What it also does is instill fear. Fear of being rejected, of being alone, of looking uncool, of not being in the know. The amalgam of all these fears becomes a sort of Leviathan Satan, to borrow loosely from Hobbes' image of the great artificial creature we've built to protect us. Only in this case, the monster isn't political order, it's cultural control. For the health and beauty industries, and all those that deal in bodily control, that Satan is a patchwork horror made of old, fat, rejected, and terribly, terribly unhealthy. With our curiosity trumped by fear, the self-flagellating thought loops keep on churning. Even if you don't buy some marketed tool like intermittent fasting, the worry that you should, or find some other way to reach the goal, still reinforces the system's core values. The control myth, competition, like for mates, attention and status, self-focus, meaning individualism, and even heteronormativity, which I'm going to get to later. What's striking, though, is that fear isn't just psychological, it's moralized. The system turns compliance into virtue, and that brings us to another of dogma's oldest tricks. This section is called Dogma's Necessary Archetypes, God and Satan. No successful dogma is complete without these aspects: good and evil, right and wrong. Because to make a holy grail look holy, you must have something unholy to hold up against it as contrast. In short, you need a Satan. That Satan holds up the fear end. It is the thing we must not be. Now, I think I need to call Foucault a friend of the podcast, because so much of my work comes out of his ideas. So we talked about this in more depth in episode 6, but here's a quick recap. Foucault shows us how the values that those in power want us to hold are often upheld by pathologizing whatever is opposite to them. So, quick example, in rationalist societies, where reason is the ideal, those who see angels, which is considered pretty unreasonable, are deemed mad. However, previously, when the church held power, seeing angels was considered great because it supported the doctrine of the time. Seeing angels was not mad at that point. Rather, those applying reason to question the Bible, they were the crazy ones. Now, what this shows is that what's labelled good or bad is not fixed. It changes over time and depending on who is in power. So, if you want people to think in ways that support the current system, there's a simple recipe to do it. Take whatever adjectives are applied to that system's holy grails and invoke their total opposite. Those total opposites become your useful Satan. As an example, under capitalism, individualism is seen as ideal, so depending on one another, that gets labelled weak and negative, or even pathologized as codependent. Now, in terms of body control dogma, well, heteronormativity comes in already, betraying that this industry really does do capitalism's work for it, but more on that in a sec. In any case, the holy grail for female people is generally thinness. For male people, generally muscle. So what is the handy opposite to both of those? Being fat. So being fat gets entered into the bad column in capitalism's Excel spreadsheet of moral assessment, right next to unproductive, enjoys carbs, and owns cats for non-Instagram purposes. The lack of links to truth when it comes to the evils of fatness, and I'm not using that word in a pejorative sense because I don't think there's anything negative about it. We've decided it's negative when it's not. So, the lack of links to truth when it comes to the evils of fatness, they won't be news to a lot of you. Fatness is not necessarily unhealthy. Thinness is not necessarily healthy. I managed thinness for most of my life and have a list of health issues that are too depressing to name, including the obvious and usual one, osteoporosis. But dogma needs us to feel like those holy grails are true, even when the facts will speak against it. So fatness has been mapped to unhealth, and fear of fat arises out of that. This helps us turn away from it and towards the idea that thin or muscly is healthy. So now we have our Satan with fat and unhealthy listed in it. and we start to equate the two, despite the data. Now, let's look at L'Oreal for a live example of how markets take this up and run with it. L'Oreal now pride themselves on doing what they call future-based marketing, which basically means monetizing fear of problems you do not yet have, namely aging. Now, youth has been an ideal for ages, so L'Oreal have turned its opposite into a pathology. Aging is now a kind of failure, and products are the cure. And while you could be forgiven for thinking L'Oreal are just the usual profit-hungry parasites, they seem to have read their Foucault and mistaken his warnings for actual tactics. Their future-based marketing pathologizes whatever is opposite to youth. Aging becomes the new Satan, something to be feared, fought, and erased. And even though aging is one thing that has never not happened, our language already reflects the dogma this industry is preaching. Fat and old are now common word associations, just like slim and healthy, even though neither pairing necessarily has anything to do with each other. In making youth and slimness into ideals, however, fat and old have to get added to the feared Satan image, and we buy weapons in the hope of annihilating them. With this Satan already accepted as Satan, science can be scanned and repurposed to furnish supporting factoids. When a study shows, for example, that collagen depletes with age, reframing that data makes buying collagen look like an act of rational self-care, like a kind of moral hygiene against the evil that is aging. And even if you never buy a single serum, the adverts will do their job. They re-anchor the values of the worldview itself. Aging is something to be feared. Control is the cure. I mean, no one would even think of wasting money on collagen if we were culturally fine about getting older. Just like, no one buys anti-sunset lamps because fortunately we still consider nightfall normal. Now, L'Oreal also makes something clear about the relationship between science and dogma. We like to think the two are opposites, that science dispels dogma. I mean, we hope that is the case. But their marketing shows the opposite can be true. Dogma can wear a lab coat. Their ads throw around words like gene science and youth-stimulating proteins, as if science soundingness alone guarantees truth. Now, incidentally, they got shut down for doing that because it turned out it was pseudoscience. What it shows, though, is when markets frame things as science, it isn't about a love of rigorous method. It's the branding value of science. They know we have more faith in things that sound scientific, which is why labelling things as such has become a standard marketing strategy. If something sounds like science, we tend to trust it, even if the methods are shoddy, undisclosed, or entirely non-existent. And this is where Foucault never really leaves the stage. Science, for most of us, is the ultimate procurer of knowledge. But for Foucault, knowledge and power are co-constitutive. In plain terms, truth doesn't float freely in the ether just waiting to be discovered. It is approved, circulated, and rewarded by institutions with something to gain. Universities, research bodies, funding councils, and corporations all act as gatekeepers of what is recognised as truth. Some findings are published, funded, or publicised. Others are buried, defunded, or dismissed, depending on whether they serve or threaten the prevailing order. Here's a quote from Foucault from Power and Knowledge. Each society has its own regime of truth. So the truths that survive are the ones that are useful to power. And when I say factoids get pulled out of context and recontextualized to fit capitalist values, it's the same mechanism. Truth is not a neutral discovery. It is a process of institutional approval. What counts as scientific is, in many cases, just what has passed through power's filter. And once a truth has proved it serves the system, it gets woven into a worldview. And when it's woven in, it supports and is supported by all the other transplanted factoids and values around it. They mutually perpetuate each other, like ideological cold sores on the lips of two closeted geriatric congressmen. Interruption. Everyone, I need to be open with you about my situation here. The loneliness industry is something that I research, write, record and edit entirely on my own. And because I can only work for about 4 hours a day due to MS, it's also what I need to make my actual job so that I can keep doing it. Now, less than 0.5% of those of you who listen have joined on the YouTube or Patreon communities, so we have less than 15 people in the community in total at the time of recording. Now, to keep going, I need to get to around 150 subscribers across Patreon and YouTube by January. By supporting it €3 a month, you're not just keeping a podcast alive, you're actually becoming part of a growing project of research and new theory on the structural roots of loneliness and how we might begin to change things. So if monthly support isn't possible, you can also help keep this project going via any purchases of albums or art prints or donations from on the website. That's at thelonelinessindustry.net. Now, this is the difference between a project that will have to end soon and becoming part of a developing awareness that keeps growing. I would love to see you become part of the community where you get extra, more personal content too, anyway. So if you do value what I do here, please become part of it. I would love to see you with us. And with that, on with the podcast. Now, it should be clear why it's such a massive win for markets when the values they're selling match the values of the broader ideology. It's like when some band writes some god-awful meandering ballad and it charts just because the chorus craps on about how great the chart system is. When a market stumbles upon a profitable value that also props up the moral order, it is gold. That idea will stick around, not because it's true, but because it's useful. The beauty industry doesn't just sell youth. It sells obedience to an ideal that keeps half the population busy chasing it. Fitness culture doesn't just sell strength. It sells self-control and competition, which also happen to be capitalist virtues. In selling two very disparate, heavily gendered ideals, the market serves another key capitalist value as well, one we talked about in episode 7, heteronormativity, which is essentially the caricaturized, polarized version of two genders, considered to be the only two genders and assumed to want to bang each other. You really notice the latter if you're non-binary, because you're somehow left with the puzzle of striving to look like both a brain-damaged battering ram and a deprivation-powered sex toy at the same time, at least until some other unattainable ideal is marketed to the rainbow community. In any case, when the dogma of profit hunting finds a match in the dogma of the broader ideology, both get reinforced, because both benefit and perpetuate each other. Capitalism itself gains moral legitimacy. It's not vanity, it's self-care. And dogma gains the advertising budget of a multinational. Each props up the other, like a matched set of bookends holding up the same shelf. And what I just described, it's pure Foucault. He showed that power doesn't just sit in governments or corporations barking orders. It works through the production of truths that define what's normal, acceptable, or good. Power manufactures knowledge, and knowledge manufactures morality. Meaning, once a claim gets dressed up as science or fact, that certificate of marriage gives birth to the next step. The fact becomes more than just a fact. It becomes a rule for how to live. And not because it's true, even when it might be, but because of who gets to say it's true. Like, fact, you are overweight, according to an outdated measure, let's remember. Rule, attached to that fact, you need to lose weight. And in this example, the measuring stick isn't a conveyor of truth, it's a producer of norms. And the reason it is called true is because it circulates within the networks that define truth itself. And this is really how the morally not really love child appears. Born through the certification of dogma's saleable facts by ideology's rubber stamp. Facts become moral imperatives. The belief that we can control our weight or muscle mass or aging becomes the idea that we should. And in terms of power, this is not because armed guards standing about shouting, exfoliate or die. What comes in here is something we've talked about before, the panopticon effect. And this marks our entry into the sociological effects of all this. The panopticon effect, outlined by Foucault, is the idea that we don't need watchers with guns to tell us, put down the baguette, carbs are forbidden. In Western culture, we internalise the watcher in our own minds. No external surveillance is needed, because we regulate ourselves in accordance with what we think the watcher wants from us. In other words, not because we're forced to do things, but because we've learned to want to do these things. We learn to want to monitor, measure, and correct ourselves. Now, we're going to get into the psychological effects of this soon enough, but for now the sociological, because oh so helpfully, in the realm of bodily control, our internal watchers become watchers we apply to one another. Yep, recall your doc, who is trained to obsess over your BMI for you, in case you do not, and will decree a problem even when you're actually feeling fit and strong. Once power and dogma align, we know what counts as normal, healthy, moral, and acceptable. We take on the policing step ourselves, sometimes in the form of screaming rants and character assassinations online, sometimes in the form of swiping left on anyone who isn't a 20-year-old anorexic or a towering, drooling brick shithouse. It starts at an early age too, in schools where kids with unusual ears, larger noses, bodies that are too short, tall, thin, fat, are teased for it and told they are ugly and wrong. All of these are symptoms we've internalised a way of seeing. Not just a bunch of products and tools, an entire world view, complete with its gods and its satans. Now here's a lived example of how we police each other until the point that we internalise the dogma. Now, a shout out to all of you who were classified as fat as kids, like I was. I went to school in rural New Zealand in the 70s and 80s. Back then, being fat was not actually so much considered unhealthy, but it was considered ugly. And living in that body taught me just the kind of policing and punishment it resulted in. Being outcast, called lazy, and so on. The kids at school did society's bidding, having swallowed the Kool-Aid without a thought, as had Bertha, the woman who gave birth to me. Now, Bertha resented having to do anything for anyone else, including her children, so she sent us to school with pre-packed potato chips for lunch because it meant she didn't have to go to any effort. At home, there was always a bunch of bread and chocolate because that is what she liked. So my being fat should not really have been much of a surprise. The interesting part is that it kind of was for her. Not only did she think that being fat was like my fault and made me ugly, she also considered it evidence of my own moral failing. So to her, I became an embarrassment. She treated me as if I had somehow done this to myself or to shame her. So she started the whole control and monitoring thing too, by putting me on a diet when I had just started school. Now, beauty already equaled thin back then, and she was indoctrinated enough to think that beauty and thinness was the be-all and end-all for female children. So she constantly sought it herself, and wanted it by proxy too, through any female child. So Bertha and the kids at school did dogma's work for it, unpaid. They rejected me for my so-called ugliness, and felt the need to teach me how important beauty was, rather than brains, for example, by virtue of my having a vagina. And Bertha may not have been able to pronounce the word heteronormativity, but she certainly believed in it, unquestioningly. And this is what Foucault is on about. Whether doctors, kids, or parents, we internalise whatever values float around, and not only police ourselves, we police everyone else too. Most people, even today, see fit to judge others' bodies, praising weight loss, even when it results from horrible diseases, and getting all concerned about weight gain. And that is, of course, sometimes totally about face in terms of actual health indicators. But we do power's work for it by reproducing dogma and ideology. As we are forced via guilt and judgment to fit in, we return this massive favour to our friends. And here we come to in-groups and out-groups. This is actually the point where dogma shines. And I'm just starting to get into René Girard, and he points out how perfectly dogma performs one of the broader ideology's favourite tactics. Ye old divide and conquer trick. In Violence and the Sacred and The Scapegoat, Girard argues that every ideology needs a scapegoat, someone to embody the Satan that keeps the system coherent. Dogma promises belonging by showing who to cast out. The faithful prove their loyalty by railing at the scapegoat, and division becomes the glue that holds the faithful together. It's performative solidarity. You don't even have to believe anymore. You only have to hate the right people. Now, it kind of works like this. Now, imagine that I am worried that I don't fit the ideal for my gender. What might make me feel better, what might make me feel like I belong more, is swiping left on anyone who is not clearly striving towards the ideal for theirs. And then I can label them lazy or not health conscious, because nothing says great match like shared self-loathing dressed up as virtue. But we do see this behaviour and logic everywhere, from politics to dating to playgrounds. Maintaining an in-group means ensuring there's always an out-group. In political terms, we call it a Feindbild, an enemy image that keeps the story moving. On the societal level, it's the same effect. Promise something better for those who comply, blame those who don't for standing in the way of paradise. And as Hannah Arendt observed, systems built on dogma survive by constantly generating enemies, real or imagined. Without division, their moral certainty would collapse. Now online, the same mechanism hums quietly beneath the hashtags. Discussions about weight, beauty or fitness, they stop being about does this work and quietly become are you one of us? Practices turn into flags, bodies become banners, and a hashtag keto selfie or a supplement stack isn't just nutrition anymore, it's a certificate of striving that earns applause. Where a single, this didn't work for me, or I have enough muscle mass already, thanks, reads as heresy, and the heretic must be shamed, blocked, or cast out. Now, it's not that different from being a teenager when you don't really know who you are yet, and all you do know is that you sure as hell don't want to be mistaken for a nerd, and that the jocks, well, they seem to get a ton of admiration, so you deride reading and computer games and hassle any nerd relentlessly until the jocks accept you. Once those in-groups form, they defend the dogma for the system, free of charge. Everyday people parrot that keto fixes everything from cancer to depression. Fear of the Satan, that is fatness, age and unhealth, keeps everyone else in line. Conform or be exiled. That's where one path to loneliness begins, for those who don't fear Satan and won't adopt or praise the holy practices. But as we move into now, even those who comply aren't delivered what was promised. The belonging built on scapegoating doesn't buy connection, it buys conditional acceptance, conditional on maintaining a subscription to dogma. This breadcrumb version of belonging falls straight into what Christopher Lasch calls the culture of narcissism. In The Culture of Narcissism in 1979, Lasch argued that under late capitalism, we don't construct a stable self at all, but a false one. A self built for display purposes only, like those hot dogs in The Simpsons, there's that hot dog rack that Homer takes one off and it's for display purposes only. A self like that. It is there for approval, for show, for survival in an economy of appearances. Again, not unlike the teenage fragile identity, not based on who I know I am, but rather on who I don't want to be judged as. Lasch describes how the real self withdraws while the performance takes its place. We learn to manage impressions instead of how to form relationships. And because that performance self depends on constant validation, it's inherently fragile. It can't tolerate contradiction. So someone calling you a nerd after all that nerd bashing, well, that's how fistfights start at school and long tirades start online. All of it is a kind of emotional capitalism. We invest in the version of ourselves that sells best and defend it like property. So even when we appear to belong, we're still performing alone. Because conditional acceptance, it doesn't connect us, it auditions us. When we try so hard to gather all the trappings and practices that ensure we'll be judged in a certain way, any questioning of those trappings and practices feels like a personal attack. And this brings us to the ugliest thing about the dogma of bodily control, the manner in which curiosity is banned. Here is where the sociological and the psychological walk hand in hand for a while. And as we talked about in last episode, there are a myriad ways to shut down inquiry. Shutting it down at all is dogma's footprint. But personal attacks, the ad hominem kind, They are the end state of Lasch's observations. They mark what happens when fragile self-concepts are propped up from the outside rather than being grounded from within. This is the fusion of creed and identity. When dogma and identity marry, we automatically rail against the person, not the argument. We are so no longer debating ideas. When dogma fuses with identity, questioning an idea is not felt as questioning the idea. It is felt as a personal attack. So, when someone questions whether cutting out carbs is really beneficial, and I snap back, "You're just doing it wrong if you don't see the benefits," it shows how much I've tangled myself up in this. Instead of engaging, I assume you're the problem and not the tool. And my logic is simple. I'm doing it right, therefore I'm right, and you're not. I've built myself a sense of superiority, entirely grounded in abstaining from baguettes. Psychologists Leon Festinger and Elliot Aronson show how this happens. When facts clash with what we've built our identity around, it creates cognitive dissonance, that unbearable static between what we believe and what we see. To ease the discomfort, we don't change the belief, we defend we ourselves as the believer. As Aronson puts it, we are not rational beings so much as rationalizing ones. Once a belief fuses with who we are, doubting it feels like doubting ourselves. Now, psychoanalyst Karen Horney adds another layer. When our idealized self is threatened, we react with shame or hostility. The more we've invested in our self-image, the disciplined one, the virtuous one, the healthy one, the more fiercely we will protect it from contradiction. And the market knows this. Entire branding manuals teach companies to fuse products with the customer's self-concept. They say, don't sell an outcome, sell the self that outcome represents. And you see how effective this is in how we talk. People who say, "Oh, I'm a gym bunny," rather than "I go to the gym," they're making identity statements. I actually heard someone say, "I'm plant-based." And I couldn't help wondering if they were under some sort of strange delusion that they weren't made of muscle and bone. But, when language turns habits into citizenships, when verbs for what you do become nouns for who you are, we might as well just say, "I'm marketing-based," and let the actual marketers go home. In any case, once a belief or brand becomes part of someone's identity, they will defend it for free. Questioning the product starts to feel like questioning who they are. Those trapped in the cage of counting macros, they won't like it when you ask whether all that control is really worth it. To them, your question sounds like sabotage. It sounds like you've suggested they swap out protein powder for pleasure, and pleasure, let's not forget, has been rebranded as moral weakness, and there is no flavour of ice cream in the world worth the internal performance review that follows. At such points, dogma has anchored itself within us, and defending it isn't about defending truth at all. It's defending the self that dogma built. And if the thing I've invested my time, money, and identity turns out to be flawed, I might be flawed too. And rather than risk that collapse, I attack the messenger. And that's the panopticon effect. What began as a marketable decontextualized factoid became a moral imperative. And that moral imperative became social policing and finally self-surveillance, the full absorption of the system's gaze. It lands, finally and effectively, as another instantiation of capitalism's favourite myth, the cult of I. It becomes, fuck you, it's all about me. Yep, arguably capitalism's favourite core value, individualism. If Foucault showed how power produces truth, Lasch shows how truth produces self, and not a stable self, but a display version that depends on constant affirmation. He points out, we are not encouraged to develop depth. And here, Byung-Chul Han's contribution is the final turn of the screw. Once self-control becomes moral law, we don't just obey, we exploit ourselves in the name of freedom. Achievement, Han writes, is the new form of obedience. We are both slave and master, boss and worker, punishment and punished. In that sense, fuck truth, it's all about me, isn't just a slogan. It's the invisible logic of our age. We defend the systems that exhaust us because they're also the systems that define us. To question them feels like disappearing. So even when the methods fail, when the diet, the practice, the product, the belief all break down, we don't abandon them. We double down. We optimize harder because control has been moralized. It's what makes us deserving. So losing it isn't just inconvenient. It feels like a moral lapse. And that's where loneliness starts to metastatize. The more we turn inward, the less room there is for anyone else. Self-monitoring replaces connection. Elevator pitches replace conversation. Wellness replaces mutual care. Capitalism's genius is that it doesn't need to isolate us physically. It only has to convince us that our private performance of perfection is a relationship with ourselves and with our best life and with some fantasy of mastery. And even though it isn't, dogma steps in to make it look that way. The dogma that resonates most with capitalism's goal is the one that echoes the self-policing inside every skull. The gaze that once judged us from the outside is now seated in our heads. And that's why the next battles don't happen on timelines or in locker rooms. They happen in mirrors, food logs, step counters, and sleepless 3 a.m. audits of discipline. We have now made the journey from the philosophical through the sociological, and now the psychological. And really, psychology itself reflects capitalism's mandate. It's a discipline that says it's all about me as well. Everything, including the locus of control, cause, blame, gets rooted back to the individual. And as we saw with Foucault, this is inaccurate. We are by no means immune to the external. Still, psychology offers us some insight because its subject, the atomized self, is where all ideology finally lands. Our bodies and minds will house the symptoms of our cultural dis-ease, where social control has become self-control. Orthorexia, bulimia, anorexia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and beyond all that, isolation. Either casting out others or ourselves. That is the end point for this particular area of dogma. For the health, beauty, fitness and menopause industries, the industries that sell control in the name of belonging and acceptance. This individual endpoint is the reason that learning the telltale signs of dogma is so important. It can literally save your life. And to lead into the actual psychologists, I will share how adhering to dogma played out for me. If you can relate to the following, my heart really goes out to you, and I know I'm not the only one who's been here. If you can't relate, I'm glad. But here goes, and trigger warning, references to eating disorders, substance abuse and other seriously subpar experiences. If that's not for you, that's okay. You can opt out. You've already made it a very long way in what is my longest episode yet. So, a lived vignette. The horror of all this lives in the gaps. First, the external ones. The gap between what Bertha, the kids at school, and wider society thought was acceptable, and how I actually looked. Then, when I joined in the judgment fest to scapegoat myself, it was the gap between what I wanted to look like and really simply couldn't achieve. Whatever it was you aspired to, you'll know this. Those gaps don't just hurt. They recruit us into endless corrections. They recruit us into hoping, buying, believing that at some point we might find acceptance. We might get to belong, or to relax and feel okay, or, for some of us, to be loved for the first time. I saw myself as I imagined others saw me, lacking, unattractive, needing to try harder. And I remember the chant, fat and ugly, fat and ugly. One of them felt unsolvable. The other, I thought I could fix with the holy grail that has not died since the 80s. Calories in, calories out. Exercise more, eat, well, almost nothing. Thus began self-surveillance. Once the observer installs behind your eyes, the day becomes micro-audits. The morning weigh-in that decides whether you've earned breakfast. The run that leaves you too exhausted to learn. The punishments after dinner out, if you went out at all. The cancellations, I'll go once I've fixed X, and half of your life gets postponed. The refusal to go anywhere where people took group photos, which is by now everywhere. The comparisons with strangers and past selves you can't resurrect. The private verdict, you're single because you don't look right. At the worst point, rituals multiplied. Macros, fasts, what I eat in a day, biomarker dashboards, keto, intermittent fasting, hauling a cross-trainer across Europe like some kind of tribute to my determination. Relationship time traded for regime time. Social invitations led to fear of being told I'd slipped, older, heavier, not toned enough. And I learned a few things. Things the advertisers edit out of adverts, like the most effective weight loss drugs are trauma, serious illness, and actual drugs. And if you're smoking or taking cocaine to stay slim, that is not health. But being congratulated for thinness whilst falling apart taught me how completely we have moralised appearance. The worst lesson? Some people praise the harm. A man I once dated said he hoped I wouldn't recover from my eating disorder because he liked his woman thin. That was actually helpful in clarifying two facts. Heteronormative scripts creep into every ideal, even when you think you've opted out. And the more perfectly you perform, the more perfectly you attract people who choose adherence over authenticity. That was the final stage. Dogma down to the cells. Instead of being in your body, you split from it, observing it, managing it, loathing it. Parts become projects, abs, skin, glutes, hormones. All this is a very specific loneliness. The loneliness of the obedient. The ones so scared of being scapegoated that they fell for the promise of belonging that came with doing it right. But conditional acceptance isn't connection. You can't arrive as yourself. You must arrive as character, like competing with others and with your own younger ghost. For some, the head loops can be quietened and they can walk into the room. For others, the debut never comes. It's always 10 pounds, tighter abs, thicker hair away. Markets keep the hope alive, selling the props the script requires, supplements, trackers, plans, poses. They don't just sell tools, they sell permission to be seen. The price is constant self-monitoring, and your time, money, sanity, and chances to actually connect. So what reads as self-control becomes a weapon turned inwards. The win condition is always one tweak away, and the loss condition is now. Live like this long enough, and your social world thins. The literature will call it avoidance, safety behaviours, impression management, perfectionistic withdrawal. Lived experience calls it, I'll go when I fit in. And that can end up being never going at all. Psychology gives us words for all this. According to the Perfectionism social disconnection model, the PSDM, when perfectionism becomes relational, meaning I must look perfect because I assume you expect me to, it undermines the very connections we hope to gain. And according to self-discrepancy theory, the gap between our actual, ideal, and ought selves doesn't just hurt, it isolates. The result? We stop being seen, and we stop seeing ourselves. The model explains why perfectionism leads to social withdrawal. The interpersonal style becomes aloof and inauthentic, which, paradoxically, fosters the very rejection the person is trying to avoid. The same model predicts shame, defensive self-preservation, lowered perceived support, and greater loneliness. In practice, you hide flaws, curate impressions, and relationships dry up. Now, we do all know that disorders like anorexia nervosa and bulimia can lead beyond loneliness to actual death. These disorders are the ultimate example of what happens when societal values are internalized and played out on our flesh. These conditions aren't limited to one gender, and in the US alone, they kill over 10,000 people a year. More recently, though, and arguably more hidden and widespread, what's known as orthorexia has come under the spotlight. Orthorexia is roughly an obsession with eating only the right foods or pure foods, and has become a topic of discussion and research. Across studies, higher orthorectic tendencies correlate with social impairment. Rigid food rules, distress eating in public, avoidance of restaurants and shared meals, conflict with family and partners over clean rules, and elevated anxiety. Clinically, orthorexia often co-travels with perfectionism and obsessive traits, the exact profile that predicts withdrawal and relationship strain. In plain language, the stricter the rules, the smaller your social world. Now, for those of us who feel that we're not quite that bad, the research is still grim in terms of loneliness. When self-esteem is pegged to how you look, daily fluctuations in appearance concerns predict same-day drops in mood and belonging, and increases in social comparison. People do report, I'll go when I look better, as a recurring postponement, which is code for self-isolation. Now, objectification theory shows us that habitual body monitoring, like, how do I look right now, is linked with anxiety, shame, and reduced relational presence. You're in the room, but not with people. You're with an imagined audience, and partners experience this as distance. Body-focused safety habits like body checking, mirror rituals, and clothing camouflage, rule-bound eating, they reduce short-term anxiety but maintain long-term fear and avoidance. Translation: the very behaviours that feel responsible keep connection out of reach. Now finally, the muscular ideal deserves attention because it is so often defended as health, even though most people engaging in it still have aims like having six-pack abs. Now that is an aesthetic goal, not an indicator of fitness. Olympic athletes don't have six-pack abs. So this often ends up being a masculinized way of obfuscating attractiveness goals and saying they're about health. The drive for masculinity research ties the pursuit of the hypermuscular body to depressive symptoms, social physique anxiety, and risky practices, and relationship conflict, particularly around training and diet rigidity. In its extreme, which is called muscle dysmorphia, diagnostic criteria include clinically significant social and occupational impairment. Different aesthetic, same isolation engine. Perfection plus identity plus rules equals less life. Now all of that is the loneliness of body control culture. When we constantly strive for the marketed ideals and tell others they should do the same, connection becomes conditional. We spend our time on things that we've been told we should want at the cost of our relationships and authenticity. We are divided from each other and from ourselves, and the body control industries rub their hands with glee. In psychological terms, this becomes learned self-withdrawal. In sociological terms, it's alienation, our relationships mediated through ideals that don't win love. And thus, the irony of buying into body control dogma is that for all the belonging it promises, the very efforts we make to avoid loneliness, controlling our bodies, acquiring the right tools, performing the right image, all of it become the tools that generate loneliness. We chase control because we're afraid, and we call that chase empowerment. But dogma begins where curiosity dies, and it stays alive by feeding on our fear. If belonging depends on displaying the right body, connection becomes conditional, and we withdraw. That's not a personal failing, that is a structural script. The good news is that scripts can be rewritten. Curiosity is how we start. Curiosity about our bodies as lived and not as displayed, about health beyond the image, about each other beyond the audition. And where curiosity returns, dogma loosens, and connection can creep in. Finally, what to do about this? If your body has become a project, relationships start happening around that project and not around you as a person. The exit ramps are not another optimization, not a 5-day reset or another ritual of control, but recognition. The first step is seeing that this path leads towards a mirage. Once you see that for what it is, well, you still may or may not want to stop chasing the chimera. I know how hard it is on a personal level to stop the conforming behaviours. But even if the personal fear of being relegated to the outgroup is still there, we can do one thing on the societal level. We can stop policing each other. We can become a safe, non-judgmental space where we stop commenting on the bodies of others in terms of the yardsticks we are sold, youth, weight, musculature, whatever else. People can ask us if they want feedback. When people offer up unprompted, they are acting as unpaid prison guards. The other thing we can do is refuse to buy into the idea that those who don't do as we do, or who can't, are therefore wrong, or immoral, or broken. And those are things that we can do, regardless of how hard it is for us personally to extricate ourselves from this worldview. And on the personal level, you are a very specific and unique person, and you do not fit into a mold, whether that be the one-size-fits-all solutions or any solution I might give. I am also not a therapist, so I can't tell you how to heal or which practice to adopt. My job, the part philosophy still does best, is to show how all this works, to map the machinery that turns fear into virtue, control into morality, and our bodies into a battleground. Because critical thinking is not about cynicism, it is about reclaiming your agency from systems that script what you're supposed to desire. So if any of this feels close to home, just start by noticing the patterns. Notice when you flinch at the word failure, or when a number on a screen feels like a moral verdict, when you catch yourself rehearsing instead of living. These moments aren't proof that you're broken, they're proof that the script is still running. So that is where my work leaves off, at recognition, at naming the trap. The next step, the part where you unlearn and rebuild, if that's what you choose to do, belongs to those who guide the process of deprogramming. People who specialise in helping us make peace with the bodies we've been taught to battle. So I'm going to hand you over to some of them. These are the ones that I have found personally helpful. I invite any of you who struggle with or have struggled with the tug of dogma and its false promises to please post your resources in the comments too, to help others. So my first one here is Eat the Rules, a podcast by Summer Innanen, who aims to free people, particularly those in female bodies, from diet culture. Beyond the Mirror is another podcast hosted by Johnny Landels, and it focuses on men's body image, fitness culture, food habits, and the pressures of appearance. More excellent podcasts are The Midlife Feast, which is hosted by Jen Salib-Huber, and the Men Unscripted podcast, which I think has moved to Substack. It is a series of anonymous conversations with men about their experiences with being in their bodies, and each conversation gives more insight into the struggles that men experience as they learn to be more comfortable in their bodies. And do you know what I found helpful? And I don't think this is just because I'm non-binary. I think that a lot of us think, we're the gender, whatever gender one has, we're the ones that struggle with this the most. It really helped to hear how everybody, regardless of their gender, struggles with this stuff. So if you identify as cis female, then go listen to the ones for cis men and vice versa. And as I said, do post resources that you have come across. I will be reading them and using them myself, so I will be grateful. So a summary I told you I'm into bad lighting. I'm not into lighting this bad, and it looks terrible, but I'm gonna try and practice what I preach here. This is going to be released with the shittiest lighting ever in terms of it. It just looks fucked. Let's face it. Hooray for non-perfection, and a summary incoming. The industry surrounding bodily control are classic examples of where dogma now presides. Despite the packaging of scientific words, curiosity has been replaced by obedience. Questioning is shut down, and dissent feels like heresy. What could have been a set of neutral methods for health becomes a moral order about worth. The message is no longer, can you control your body, but you should control your body. And failing to do so is framed as weakness, laziness, and even sin. Now, this dogma is the perfect vehicle for capitalism's values, which is why it is so all-pervasive and successful. Control, competition, individualism, and heteronormativity are the golden children of this system, and the body becomes their playground. Each holy grail, the diet, the fast, the workout, the serum, rehearses those same values: self-surveillance, productivity, comparison, and hierarchy. Power no longer needs to police us. We police ourselves and each other for free. Psychologically, that control curdles into fragmentation. We internalize the gaze, turn our bodies into projects and our lives into audits. The result isn't mastery, but isolation. Connection replaced by comparison. Care replaced by correction. Loneliness, quite obviously here, becomes structural, the byproduct of a system that moralizes self-improvement and monetizes worry about inadequacy. So we need to say no to doing power's work for it. No to monitoring, judging, and annihilating ourselves in the name of virtue. Learn to love people and not packaging, And I am not saying this from some completed work, as I said. I have managed to get to the stage where I find dad bod hot as hell, but I can only manage indifference towards my own reflection. But that's the point. The struggle itself is proof of how deep this script runs. Body control is a colossal industry built on moral judgment, on what's acceptable, healthy, beautiful. Its icons are symbols, not realities. Their very unattainability is what makes them profitable. But if I've done my job today, you'll know why and how we were conscripted into this battle in the first place. And maybe you'll see that the war was never yours to fight. And with that, thanks for listening. Bye.